Dr.Valéry Giroux has dedicated her work to the moral and legal protection of non-human animals. Dr. Giroux completed her Master's in Law and PhD in Philosophy from the University of Montreal. Her doctoral thesis argues for the moral necessity of granting basic legal rights to all non-human sentient beings. She is currently the coordinator at the Center of Research Ethics at the University of Montreal and is currently working on a paper on the ethics of control for the paper of animal ethics, or for the Encyclopedia of Animal Ethics. Dr. Giroux has published numerous articles on animal rights, as well as translated many texts by Dr. Gary Francione into French. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Valéry Giroux. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Hello everyone. You doing well? Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'd like to thank Nicole particularly for this kind invitation. I have to say that I was astonished by the quality of the work done by the Executive Committee of the Western Ontario Vegan Society in the preparation of this event. The result of this fantastic work is that I feel a lot of pressure now. I hope I won't be disappointing anyone. What I'd like to present to you today is the last portion of the argument that I've been working on in my PhD studies in philosophy at the University of Montreal. First, in a nutshell, I'll introduce the general structure of this argument, and then I'll go into further detail about the last section and its focus on the exploitation per se of sentient beings. So we generally accept that an act of discrimination needs to be justified by a valid moral reason in order to be morally acceptable. According to Aristotle, though different cases can be treated differently, similar cases a priori should be treated similarly. To discriminate between two beings without valid justification, merely on the basis of their respective species would be, speciesist, morally speaking, and be just as wrong as racism, sexism, or homophobia. Most of our acts of discrimination between species present no ethical problem. It is certainly all right for the director of a university, for instance, to refuse admission to all sentient non-humans. In most cases, there is a valid justification for treating humans and non-humans differently. Unfortunately, some types of discrimination are much more problematic, and among these, the most crucial concern our attribution of certain fundamental moral and legal rights. Fundamental legal rights, as affirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada, more than any other type of rights, create a thick barrier of protection around individuals, and even though they are never absolute, they admit only very exceptional derogations. And from the interest-based rights perspective, which explains much better than the will theory of the function of rights, why we consider that all human beings have rights, fundamental legal rights are there to protect some of the interests that the legal subjects might have, usually are most important, and those closely tied to the inherent value of a person. The interest-based rights approach, combined with the Aristotelian principle that like cases should be treated alike, leads us to the principle of equal consideration of interests. This principle demands that equal interests be treated equally, regardless of any other characteristics that is not logically linked to the treatment at issue. If we want to give an individual a right, based on a certain interest that we consider this individual might have, we need to grant every other being that might have the same interest, that same right, unless we have a valid moral reason not to do so. I'm concerned with the three basic interests that are intimately linked to what can be considered the most fundamental of our human rights. They are, first, the interest in not suffering, which forms the basis of the right to not be tortured or the right to physical security. Second, the interest in continued existence, which provides the ground for the right to not be killed or the right to live. And third, the interest in not being used, which gives rise to the right to not be enslaved or appropriated, or the right to liberty. Because I prefer to focus on the last of these three rights, let's take for granted that it is very possible and even probable that all sentient beings have an interest in not suffering and an interest in staying alive. Since the fundamental right not to be tortured and not to be killed serve the purpose of protecting these respective interests, the principle of equal consideration of interest forces us to grant all sentient beings the fundamental right to physical security and the fundamental right to life. It follows that unless we have more valid moral reasons not to reach this conclusion, there is no justification for inflicting pain on sentient beings or for killing them, even painlessly. But what about using animals in a soft and gentle way, without killing them? There are many uses of animals that seem to not necessarily implicate either pain or death. Are these practices morally defendable, even though we would never use human beings the same way, at least without their consent? What could make these uses morally acceptable if they involve non-human animals, but unacceptable if they involve human ones? It should be noted that an indirect argument could and should alone suffice to convince us to stop all sorts of animal exploitation. Many of the purposes that are served by the exploitation of animals could theoretically be reached by methods that don't involve pain or death. Nonetheless, the animals we are currently using for our ends are, as a matter of fact, suffering and dying. Indeed, we only have to think of the animals we raise for their milk, eggs, and wool, those we use for entertainment or sports, the ones we exploit for the help they can provide to the physically disabled or for search and rescue missions, the animals we use for scientific purposes, or even the ones we use for companionship or pets. Right now, the immense majority of these sentient non-humans are indeed suffering from our use of them and will die prematurely because of their exploitation. Could it be different? Will it be different? What are the chances that we'll be, one day, able to exploit these animals without violating their interest in not suffering and their interest in not dying? As Gary Francione argues, as long as animals are our property, it will be a practical impossibility to respect their interest in not suffering and their interest in not being killed. As long as they are considered things, merchandise, property, or resources, they will simply continue to be used as mere means to human ends and suffer and die for it. The property status of animals makes it impossible to genuinely balance their interests when they are opposed to even the most trivial human interest. Just as human slaves' interests could never win when weighted against their owner's interest, animal slaves' interests are doomed to be forgotten or pushed aside as soon as there is some economic advantage to be gained from the denial of these interests, even if the most fundamental. The only solution to avoid inflicting pain on non-human animals, Professor Francione argues, is to do away with this property status and to grant all sentient beings the most fundamental and pre-legal right not to be used at all by humans. This was a practical and sort of indirect argument, but there is a more direct argument that also leads to the abolition of all forms of animal exploitation. Even if it was possible to treat non-humans as mere means to our ends without inflicting any pain upon them and without killing them, we would still have to be able to explain why this should be considered morally different from a humane form of human slavery. As Francione says, the more vicious ways of exploiting a being are obviously worse than the less vicious ones. But this doesn't mean that the latter types of exploitation are morally acceptable. Human slavery, however humanely managed theoretically, is totally unacceptable. So why would humane animal slavery be morally acceptable? How could we morally justify treating non-human and human slavery so differently? Is it possible that only humans have an interest in not being used per se, in not having their freedom of movement restricted, in not being bought and sold, in not being submitted to the arbitrary will of an owner? It is hard to identify precisely what causes every human being to have a fundamental interest in not being enslaved, however humanely they are treated. What does it mean exactly to be free? In political philosophy, the concept of liberty is sometimes defined as the capacity for a being to realize its nature, to self-determine or to control its own passion. From the vocabulary favored by Isaiah Berlin, this type of liberty is called positive liberty, and it rests on the autonomy of the agent. This is the kind of liberty that seems to interest authors such as Alasdair Cochrane, who believes that there are only certain human beings, those who have the capacity to frame, revise, and pursue their own conception of the good, who can have an intrinsic interest in being free. The main problem with Cochrane's analysis is that a positive concept of liberty is not the only paradigm of freedom. In fact, it is not even the one that is favored by most authors who prefer the negative concept of liberty. Yet, negative liberty simply refers to the absence of interference from others, interference that would prevent agents from doing what they want. Based on this interpretation of liberty, it seems that all the beings who can move freely, who are capable of intentionality, and who can be moved by their own desires or preferences, can get hurt if their motivations or inclinations are stopped by an external agent. We now have good reason to suppose that all sentient beings are capable of intentional actions, beliefs, and desires. It is not necessary that an individual be autonomous in the Kantian sense in order to have an interest in being negatively free. To have this type of interest, it is indeed sufficient that interference from others which prevents the individual to do as she wishes inherently causes her damage. But all sentient non-humans, even if they were moved only by their instincts or their desires and never by their rationality, would still be hurt if an agent prevented them from behaving as they are inclined to behave, since it would cause them to feel pain, fear, anxiety, stress, or, at the very least, frustration. For this reason, it seems reasonable to conclude that sentient animals have a certain kind of interest in being free. More precisely, they have an interest in the negative type of liberty. From this perspective, the difference between an intrinsic and an instrumental interest in liberty collapses. Thus, if the concept of freedom is interpreted in its negative sense, as it generally is, it seems that all sentient animals can have a genuine interest in being free, and as a result, deserve the right to benefit from this freedom. That said, it doesn't follow that the negative liberty of all animals used by human beings for their own ends would necessarily be violated. Indeed, it seems plausible to imagine certain cases where an animal could still be the property of a human owner without getting much interference from his master. Let's take the example of a dog born in a human society who has been taught to cross the streets at green lights only, exclusively through positive reinforcement training methods with the use of rewards only and no punishment whatsoever. This dog is free to go wherever he wants, even outside through his dog door with no leash or collar, to eat and drink when he wants, to rest when he feels like it, without ever being limited in his initiatives. This dog could keep his property status and yet never suffer from the interference of his owner in his activities. His negative interest in being free is being respected, even if legally he is still a thing as opposed to a person. Can we then conclude that it is possible, at least theoretically, to exploit sentient non-humans like that dog while respecting their interest in liberty? Should we follow Cochrane in saying that it would be sufficient to improve the way we treat the sentient animals we use for our pleasure and to refrain from killing them? Saying that an animal can be free while still owned by a human being is highly problematic. The situation of this dog is analogous to what is denounced by some authors who criticize the concept of negative liberty, in observing that it opens the door to the possibility for human slaves to be considered free, as long as their master is nice enough not to exercise his power to do as he pleases with them. Our dog is free to move around as he pleases and capable of satisfying his desires. But because he is legally considered as a property of his owner, he is still constantly at risk to lose this liberty, since his master can suddenly decide to treat him differently or to give him to another owner not as nice. Similarly, because they find themselves under the authority of their master, the human slaves who are owned by a good master, who don't interfere in their day-to-day lives, are still dominated by their owner, who can always decide to exert more control over them and to limit their negative freedom. In these circumstances, can we say that the dog and the slaves owned by good masters are really free? Isn't it the case that their interest in liberty involves more than freedom from interference? Many political philosophers think that an interpretation of liberty which reduces freedom to the absence of external constraints forces us to admit that the slaves can be free, which is, in their opinion, deeply counterintuitive and clearly unsatisfactory. In order to avoid this implication, these authors are trying to resurrect a third concept of liberty, the one that was favored by English anti-monarchists in the beginning of the 17th century. These dissidents claimed that the subject submitted to the authority of a supreme monarch could never be considered free. Indeed, even if the king was tolerant and let them do what they wanted without interfering in their lives, the subjects would still be living under the constant threat of seeing their lives turned upside down by his decision to start limiting their movements or other initiatives. And it is, in their opinion, this precariousness in itself that violates the political liberty of the subjects. Quentin Skinner, on the views of the opponents of the Stuart monarchy, was saying, by emphasizing its prerogative rights, the crown was laying claim to a form of discretionary and hence arbitrary power that had the effect of reducing the free-born people of England to a condition of bondage and servitude. Contemporary authors such as Quentin Skinner and Philip Petit believe that the notion of freedom has more to do with the absence of domination than with that of interference. In their view, being free means not being dominated by other people, not being subordinated to others' will, and not being subjected to their moods or desires. These authors think that non-interference is insufficient. True liberty requires freedom from the arbitrary power of others. What is meant by arbitrary power is the power to interfere as one wants with complete immunity, or in a manner that places the agent who is subjected to this power in a situation where he disposes of no means to obtain condemnation or reparation in case of actual interference. This concept of liberty, called the Republican liberty, depends on the structure of the relationship existing between individuals or groups more than on the accidental result allowed by this structure. Since they have an interest in not being prevented from doing as they wish, sentient non-human animals also have an interest in not finding themselves in a situation where this primary interest is weakened by an inferior moral and legal status. If they have interest in not being interfered with, non-human sentient beings also have an interest in not being at risk of being subjected to such an interference. They have an interest in liberty in the negative and the Republican sense of the term. Since the fundamental right to freedom is there to protect our basic interest in liberty, and since all sentient non-human might have an interest in liberty, the principle of equality demands that we extend a fundamental right to freedom to all sentient beings. Although some important problems continue to plague the enforcement of laws prohibiting abusive conduct and domination between human individuals, numerous societies have come to condemn slavery and dictatorship. In contrast, all non-human animals are victims of human domination, since they find themselves in a situation where either they are being actively interfered with in a damaging way by human beings, or they live under the constant threat of becoming subjected to such an interference. In this important sense, their situation corresponds exactly to the situation of the slaves. Because of their moral and legal status as things, as all animals, including those who are sentient and who most probably have, like we do, interest in not being interfered with, are subjected to oppression and domination by human beings. Of course, we are nice enough to protect them against acts of pure sadism by criminalizing these acts, and we claim to be sensitive to animals' well-being by opposing to their ill treatment and demanding that the methods used to exploit them be replaced by more humane ones. Some of us are even willing to pay a bit more money to buy products that come from animals raised on organic farms, where they are supposedly better treated than on industrial farms. But this charity is not justice. It doesn't break the relation of domination between human and non-human animals. In refusing them the status of equals, we give ourselves the right to determine as we please what they can be subjected to. And it is this power that allows us, on the one hand, to pretend to be motivated to treat well the animals we use, and on the other hand, to abuse them as seriously and systematically as we do. Because the interests of an individual are not only threatened, but violated when this individual has an inferior status, there can be no real justice as long as there are inequality and domination between sentient animals. A good way to make sure that the non-human sentient beings are no longer dominated would be to offer them the Republican type of liberty and to grant them the moral and legal status of persons. then and only then will be able to say that their fundamental interests and ours are equally protected. Then and only then will be able to say that their fundamental interests were equally considered, and that the principle of equality, which lies at the basis of all our best theories of justice, was respected. Considering all this, it seems that we have to respect a strong presumption against the discrimination between sentient, human, and non-human animals with respect to the most basic interests and rights. Therefore, we need to acknowledge our moral obligation to equally consider all sentient animals' interest in not suffering, interest in staying alive, and in interest in not being used as a mere resource. That means that we need to extend to all non-human sentient, all sentient non-humans the fundamental rights to not be tortured, to not be killed, and the most basic of all, the right to not be appropriated, exploited, are considered inferior. In other words, we need to do as Gary Francione says, and grant all sentient beings the equal status of person, and in the words of Dr.Valéry, admit that the most fundamental human rights shouldn't be limited to human beings only, but rather extended to all intentional beings. This leads to the necessity of abolishing all forms of animal exploitation. Indeed, respecting the principle of equal consideration of interests means that we have the moral obligation to leave all free-living animals alone, protecting their natural habitat from human colonization and more generally from environmental damages would obviously be a good idea. In fact, doing so would also be a question of fundamental justice. As for the domesticated animals, the fundamental rights perspective leaves us most safely to the end of the institution of domestication as a whole, including pet ownership. That's what Francione demands. Unless, following Donaldson and Kimlicka, we're very optimistic toward the human capacities to treat their fellow sentient beings with respect. Then, this perspective might lead us to the extremely well-regulated attribution of the status of citizens to some of the non-humans who are already domesticated and who could arguably have an interest in reproducing. On an individual level this time, the fundamental rights approach requires the adoption of a vegan way of life. That is to stop in our everyday choices using or encouraging all products or services that come from the exploitation of sentient beings. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to know if you are all convinced that we should go vegan, or if you already are all vegans. Maybe some questions or